Well, how familiar are you with the book series, Where's Waldo? Familiar with this? It's a series that was created in the 1980s in England, where in England, the main character is actually Wally, not Waldo, as he is in North America. Did you know that? And the books have a series of illustrations depicting people doing a variety of amusing things, and readers are challenged to find Waldo, with his red and white striped shirt and his hat and his glasses, and somewhere he's hidden among the pages. And would you believe that with a relatively simple concept that's kind of like hide and seek used to be, more than 80 million books have been sold around the world. He's inspired television programs and Halloween costumes and commercials and comic strips and spin-off books and live action and video games, and even a breakfast cereal. In 2017, the Guinness World Record for the largest gathering of people dressed as Waldo was broken and captured by people in Japan, beating the people who did it in 2011 in Ireland. 4,626 Waldos, all at once. Imagine, that's a lot of red and white. But what is it that makes finding Waldo so popular, do you think? Or dressing up and being Waldo? There is something about finding and being found that is appealing to us. As I said, a kind of a modernized version of the classic hide and seek. I wonder if we dig a little beneath the surface, I wonder if part of the reason that it is so popular is that we spend quite a bit of our lives hiding parts of ourselves from one another, and in some ways hoping never to be found out, and in other ways longing to be found. This past week, there was quite a bit of commotion online anyway, because a South African preacher had predicted that the rapture would take place on September 23rd or 24th. Now, I don't know if you are familiar with the rapture. It's a description of an event that some evangelical Christians believe will mark the end of human history. So Jesus will return to earth and suddenly take all of his followers to heaven, as in people will just disappear, be raptured, so to speak. This rapture concept doesn't appear in the Bible anywhere. It is a way that some people have interpreted, I might say imagined, select verses of the New Testament as a way the world might end. And the concept of this imagined rapture is that the special good people are going to disappear to be with Jesus, and those who are not so good are going to be left behind. So you maybe have heard of the Left Behind books and movies that are based on the people who don't make the rapture. Anyway, so the internet was abuzz this week about whether something dramatic was going to happen. I was particularly amused by the person who reached out to an online influencer and asked them to look after their dog once they were raptured. And the influencer couldn't help but say, wait, let me get this straight. You're reaching out to tell me that you think I'm a good enough person to look after your dog, but not good enough to go with you to heaven. I think it all speaks to the idea of wanting to be found and of being worthy of being found. Even that, social media influencer who had really no belief in this imagined end of the world, and surely no relationship with this dog owner, was still a bit wounded by the fact that they wouldn't be considered good enough to go to heaven. And I suspect we could spend a lot of time examining how much of people's activity on social media in general, on the internet, especially those who are influencers asking you to like their content, is related to their desire to be found or found worthy. Well, you might think that because of all this internet stuff, that it's a new problem, but it's really not. Because that theme of longing to be found and the struggle to be worthy is in the Bible all over the place. In this psalm that we heard today, Psalm 139, is attributed to King David, which means that it would have been written about 3,000 years ago. So apparently this is not a new issue for humans. And in this psalm, David speaks to a God who has searched him and known him. A God who knows whether he sits or whether he stands, a God who knows what he's thinking and what he's feeling even before he speaks it. Now, some of us might find that idea actually a little bit troubling. If you have ever felt trapped in any sort of abusive relationship, if you have been the victim of any stalking behavior, you could well be triggered by the idea of a God who is hemming you in from every side and will not let you go. And for any of us who carry any shame within us about who we are or something we have done or not done, the concept of God's intimate knowledge about that could be a little frightening. Just ask Jonah or anyone else who has ever tried to run away from God. So here's what I think is the most important thing to understand about this psalm. David is describing a God who is interested in relationship, not judgment. Let me say that again. This God and this psalm are about relationship and not judgment. This is not a God who's looking to control David's behavior. David's very life is clear evidence of that. This is a God who loves every part of David, despite all of his missteps, and even despite his achievements. Think about what we know about David. When he was a young shepherd boy, he was anointed as Israel's king by the prophet Samuel. So that's pretty good. Get anointed king as a teenager. But then for most of his young adult life, he spent his time running away from King Saul, who wanted to kill him. Not so good for the self-esteem, I would think. Then David became king in his 30s, and he reigned as king for 40 years. So you can kind of get get used to the power you have there, I suppose. Because while David ruled Israel well, and he had many victories in battle, he did not always use his power well or wisely. Among other things, he committed adultery with Bathsheba, and today I think we might call that rape or sexual assault. And then he killed her husband so that he could marry her. But thanks to the prophet Nathan, who kept showing up and confronting David about his behavior, this great King David often found himself re-examining his choices and his motives and having to acknowledge the harm he had done and the consequence of his actions. So that's kind of a complicated man and a complicated life. And it is a man like that, with that complicated story, who is praying and singing to a God who wouldn't abandon him. That in the midst of all of that complicated life, a God who would still find him, would still know him, would stay with him, would love him, and would even transform him. Who could handle the worst that David had to offer, because even my darkness isn't dark to you, O God. A God who could still remind him that he was wonderfully made. So, what of us thousands of years later? I wonder whether you trust that you are wonderfully made. Do you feel known and worthy of love? It seems to me that one of the things that can block us from having inner peace is the feeling or the concern that we are not, in fact, wonderfully made. That if we were truly known, maybe we wouldn't be truly loved. Maybe you're carrying around some shame about your appearance, or your body image, or your family, or your parenting. You might feel insecurity about money, or work, or health, or sex, or aging, or religion. You might be dealing with depression, or addiction, anxiety, or aggression. If we're not feeling good about ourselves, it may relate to the expectations that come at us from every direction about how we should be and what we should be and who we should be. Or maybe we have anger or hurt that we just can't figure out how to let go. We're holding on to grudges or pain or betrayal, and we have let it define who we are inside. In her book, Daring Greatly, Brené Brown describes a transforming experience for her. She says, "I remember a very tender moment when my husband Steve and I were lying on the floor watching our daughter Ellen do a series of crazy arm-flinging, knee-slapping dances and tumbles. And I looked at Steve and I said, isn't it funny how I just love her that much more for being so vulnerable and uninhibited and goofy? I could never do that. Can you imagine knowing that you are loved like that?" And then she comments, honestly, first Steve looked at her and said to her, "I love you exactly like that." And then she says, honestly, as someone who rarely risks vulnerability and always steers clear of silly or goofy, it never dawned on me that adults could love each other like that I could be loved for my vulnerabilities, not despite them. I think it's Mel Robbins who says that one of the ways we can start to see ourselves with this kind of affection is to do something that's actually pretty cheesy. So you might have to stay with me. She says what we should do is we should go and look at ourselves in the mirror and actually look at ourselves in the eye. So that might be a problem for some of us. So look yourself in the eye, and then here's the cheesy part. Give yourself a high five. And she says, because if you think about it, when do you give someone a high five? You never give someone a high five as an insult, ever. It's always like, way to go, or something good, or something encouraging. And she said, as a result, brain scientists tell us that it's pretty impossible for our brains to think negatively about the image in the mirror while we are making a high five move. It just doesn't compute in our brains. So she says, I know it's weird, but go and do it and give yourself a high five in the mirror every day for a week. And see if you start to feel just a little bit different about yourself. Brain chemistry says you might. I suspect that is a similar reason that the African-American theologian Howard Thurman is known to have prayed this psalm, Psalm 139, every morning of his adult life. His version of giving himself a high five, so to speak. I like what Andrew Connors says about it. The trouble that most of us are having is grounding ourselves in something other than the really bad news that continues to pound away on us every day, chipping away at our sense of hope, not just in the future, but in our fellow citizens, forming us into people who are driven too much by fear and not enough by courage and light and possibility. All the ingredients that are needed by people who want to take that bad news and transform it, as much of it as possible, into something better. This little psalm in the middle of the Bible, I think, tries to show evidence of that transforming potential in the mystery of our lives. We are fearfully and wonderfully made, shaped by a God whose knowledge of us is kind of astounding, whose investment in humanity is humbling and inspiring, who invites us to treat ourselves and each other as worthy. Turns out, we are all Waldo, and we are all worthy of being found. Thanks be to God.